Right now for breaking news. We have a juror question, you guys. This is a breaking update. And I think that's the beauty of the live stream that we have here. I'm live in the Southern District of Manhattan, the courthouse here behind me. And kind of what we have as our setup is we have our camera ready, our lights going. Elizabeth Milner and I are sitting here waiting for any updates. Elizabeth gets the notification. Okay, we've got an update from the courtroom. She runs in there. I hop in front of the camera so we can bring you the latest. And that's just what I'm doing now. So here's what we have from the courtroom behind me. This is according to Maureen Comey. She says that the jury is asking for transcripts from 2 witnesses. And Maureen Comey, of course, is the lead prosecutor for the government. So it sounds like just about 7 hours, a little bit past worth of deliberations. And we now have another question from the jury asking for 2 transcripts of witness testimony. I've got a lot of questions, and I bet you guys do too. So if you have them, make sure to write them and send them into the chat there, and we'll get to as many as we can because, of course, we want to know what's happening. And the good news about Law and Crime is that we come prepared, right? So I'm ready to go live, and we have our studio live too, actually, with our lead legal counsel. So let's bring her in right now. This is Elizabeth Vulai. I bet you Law and Crime viewers remember her. She's been on a lot. Elizabeth, thank you for coming on at the drop of a hat to make sense of all of this with us. So what are you thinking, Elizabeth? These jurors want transcripts from 2 witnesses. What are your initial thoughts?
Yeah, so it's not surprising. I mean, again, you think about the mountains of evidence that the jurors have to go through, all of the witness testimony. We're talking about multiple weeks of testimony here. So the fact that they want to be able to go back and look at certain transcripts is not surprising. Again, from the very first week, we saw multiple witnesses, former victims of Combs, people that witnessed, allegedly things happening between him and Cassie and other people. So there's a variety of things that they've listened to at this trial. So the fact that they want to go back and be able to, look through, unfortunately, we don't know, which witnesses, we don't know what they're looking at, but it does make sense. And again, the amount of responsibility that they have on their hands, if he's fully convicted, he could face up to the rest of his life in prison. So they've got a really, really weighty decision on their hands. So it's not surprising they want to go back and, ask for certain things. I think we'll continue to see that.
I think you're right, and it shows that the jurors are taking their job seriously because, to your point, this is about 2 months that they've been hearing testimony from witness after witness, seeing text messages or videos or photos, and it's a lot. I mean, we overall here remember the highlights, right? Of course, Kathy, Jane, and Mia, but there were so many other witnesses that the government also felt were important enough to call during all of this. And again, to your point, Elizabeth, we don't know exactly which witnesses these jurors were questioning or wanting the transcripts from. I know in my mind who I would guess. Could you venture a guess who you think they want the testimony from?
Yeah, it's tough to speculate. I would imagine that they might want to get testimony from some of the former victims, possibly Cassandra Ventura, because in my opinion, she really was the strongest witness when it came to testifying as to all the different levels of charges against Combs. So again, everything from the racketeering to the trafficking, all the alleged drug charges and everything in between. So, and she testified for a long time, with cross-examination in her testimony. She was up there, I believe, for about a week. So it wouldn't surprise me if they want to pull something from her, possibly, maybe from one of the former escorts who alleges that, he engaged in these freak-offs with Cassandra Ventura. It could also be that they might want to pull from some of the other alleged victims who testified against Combs as well. They didn't testify for quite as long as Cassie, so it could be something like that. That would be my guess, is probably one of the victims, because again, they have the most allegedly, firsthand knowledge of what's going on or what happened.
That's where my mind went to, Elizabeth, especially because we've had these people on, to your point, multiple days. I mean, Kathy was on probably the most, but Mia and Jane, their testimony and their cross-examination, direct and cross, was pretty lengthy. And so, of course, they're going to remember the highlights, they meaning the jurors, but I'm sure there are specifications in the transcripts that they're going to want to kind of hone in. And I'm also wondering, by the way, we do have some viewer questions, and I'll get to them in a second, but I have another question for Elizabeth myself. I'm wondering, does this show us anything about deliberations, perhaps where they are in terms of reaching a verdict or what they could be discussing?
Yeah, it's difficult to say for sure, but I think it's I don't think it's that at the very beginning stages of deliberation, right? They started yesterday officially, early in the day yesterday. They got the judge's instructions. They had a whole day. So I think it seems like they used that day to their advantage and discussed all of the different charges. And the fact that they're asking already for copies of the transcripts means that they want to double check things. I think it also, to me, it seems like they might already have a decision somewhat made up in their minds, at least some of them. So they want to really double check to make sure the evidence that they think is there was actually there. To me, it could also be an indication of possible disagreement. Maybe some of the jurors think one way, some of the other jurors think the other way, and they want to be able to really cross-reference the transcripts to see, can we come to some sort of unanimous verdict here? So I think it could be either one of those.
I mean, we all just want to be a fly on the wall of the deliberation room, right? There are so many different options of what all of this could mean. And I do want to go now to some of our viewer questions because we do have a couple of really good ones. This one is from Michelle S. Kennedy. Here's what she says. Question: if it goes to retrial, can prosecutors go after different charges or use different witnesses? Thanks for all you do. Your trial coverage has been great. Thank you, Michelle, for watching, and all of you who have been sending us such positive messages. We love to hear that. So, Elizabeth, I'm going to shoot that one over to you. What happens if there's a retrial?
That's right. So retrial is basically the prosecutors get to do the trial all over again. So they get to put forward the same witnesses, the same evidence, same charges, but they have an opportunity to make changes. And we've seen that happen in other cases in the past. The Menendez case, for example. Having a retrial doesn't exactly mean that you can do the exact same thing. They could try to push for the same witnesses and same charges, but you're not 100% sure if it's going to be an exact repeat. So there might be certain witnesses that they can't put on if there's a retrial. There might be additional witnesses or additional evidence that they could put on. The benefit of a retrial, even though it's an arduous process, is the prosecutors have more time to uncover more possible details. So they could go after the same charges. It all just depends on what the judge says, and they could try to push for additional evidence, less evidence. They have an opportunity to maybe learn from what they did the first time. It just depends on what the judge will allow, because again, we've seen in cases prior, again, mentioning the Menendez case, where the judge ruled out a lot of evidence the second time around. So they could try to push for the same charges and same trial, but it just depends on the judge.
And again, we are jumping ahead if we're talking about a retrial. It's a possibility. We just saw this in Karen Read. I'm sure a lot of our viewers who are watching now were watching the live stream there, and we did see it. So it is possible. Also in the Harvey Weinstein case, we saw a mixed verdict, right? We saw that one was a hung jury. So it is possible to have a retrial. But again, we're still in deliberations, a bit over 7 hours now. And I do have another update for you from the courtroom. As Agnifilo, Shapiro, Steele, and Westmoreland huddle, by the way, these are all defense attorneys, as they huddle back by gallery, AUSA Comey turns and confirms with Combs' Xavier Donaldson seated in the middle table. Door to holding cell half opens, U.S. Marshal checking to see if it's time to bring Sean Combs out. Eventually, Sean Combs has now been brought out, and his lead lawyer, Mark Agnifilo, is talking with him. Shapiro and Westmoreland are working together on something on Shapiro's laptop. So it seems like everyone is involved here. And Elizabeth, I'm going to toss to you for this next question about all of it too. As far as Diddy being included in all of this, I know I was asking our reporter, Elizabeth Milner. That's kind of what we say here at Law and Crime, reporter Elizabeth or lawyer Elizabeth. So including both of you in this, I was asking reporter Elizabeth, where is Diddy during all of this, as we're waiting during deliberation? And she says he is in a holding cell nearby. But whenever there's anything, we got to bring him back out and make sure that he's included. Is that right, lawyer Elizabeth?
Right, that's correct. So let's say if there was any sort of question that was brought forward by the jury, if there's any sort of sidebar, like we call it, not the sidebar with Jesse Weber, but sidebar meaning conversations between both sides of counsel and the judge, then he has the right to be there. Again, this is his case. He has the right to representation and to a fair trial. So that's typically when they would bring him out. I did get a little excited when you mentioned that they were bringing him out because I thought, could they have a possible verdict already? It's still kind of a little bit early. It's only the second day. So I'd be surprised if they came up with something this fast. But yeah, so basically anytime there's any sort of conferring with the judge and counsel, he would be brought in because he has the right to know, obviously, what's going on with his case.
It's so funny. Whenever we get an update, initially what it says is that the jurors have a note. And so immediately everyone's like, okay, is it a verdict? Is it go time? What is it? And then, of course, we learn maybe 20 minutes later what it actually is. But you're right, Elizabeth. We all want to know what is going on with the jurors. And I know that our viewers want to know too. For those of you just tuning in, make sure to send us any of your questions into the chat. We've gotten some really good ones so far. This one is from Carrie RD. What is verdict watch? And this is a quick explainer I can just give. Right now, we're in verdict watch, meaning that the jury is in deliberations. They're talking, conferring about whatever they may be discussing that we may or may never know about. And so right now, we're watching and waiting for a verdict. And that's why we're doing this live coverage, because throughout verdict watch, there are updates such as this. Right now, the jurors want a couple of transcripts from prior testimony. And so we're here to give you updates. It could kind of give us a clue as to what way perhaps jurors are thinking. Are they close to wrapping up deliberation? Is there a hung jury? I mean, there's so many different options. So that's what Verdict Watch is. And welcome to Law and Crime's Verdict Watch. We're happy to have you here. I have another question. This one is from Jesse Davin. Question: does the court reporter read back the testimony in a monotone voice? How do they review testimony? I think it depends on the court reporter. Elizabeth, what is your experience?
It depends on the court reporter, but also what happens every single day of trial is that the court, and God bless the court reporters out there because it's not an easy job, but basically they're responsible for transcribing everything that happens each day of trial. And at the end of trial, they have to prepare that transcript, right? And it's disseminated. Obviously, it's disseminated amongst some members of the media. Counsel gets a copy. So each day you get a copy of that transcript. So thankfully, if the judges want to go back and look at pieces of testimony, they have that there and they don't necessarily have to go to the court reporter. If they wish to do so, then she can. But it would probably be a lot easier if they could just ask for references from the trial transcript. And that's why, we have amazing court reporters. That's really their job.
Oh, I'm so thankful for court reporters all over, specifically in this case, because it is a federal trial. So unfortunately, we can't live stream what's going on inside the courtroom. Obviously, in any sort of court situation, we can't live stream what's going on as far as deliberation. But in other trials, in some states, we can live stream all of the testimony, the openings and closings. We do it right here on Law and Crime. The difference with this case, however, is that it's federal. So there are simply no cameras allowed in the courtroom. And that's also why I've been so thankful for these court reporters, because we get the transcripts every night about 2 hours after court. And generally, I break them down on my show, Scandal, which if you're interested in P. Diddy or any sort of true crime, celebrity gossip, things like that, make sure to subscribe because we talk about all things Diddy, all things celebrity. And really, I do rely a lot on those transcripts because there's only so much a person can remember, a reporter can remember. I mean, we're talking 8 hours of testimony per day. The transcripts are really the tell-all. And I do think that's important for jurors to be able to go back because our memories don't, recall every single second of it. Again, I could just talk about the transcripts for days. I love them. I do have another viewer question, though, and this one is from Sydney Sexton. She says, question: while the jurors deliberated, is it just the jurors present, or is there a court clerk, a bailiff monitoring the process? This is a great question, Sydney. Elizabeth, can you explain it?
It's a great question. So typically they do have some sort of bailiff or court reporter that's available to assist them with whatever they need. Typically, and the way that it should work is in that jury deliberation room, which we've all seen photos of. And like you said, Sierra, we all wish we could be a fly on that wall. But typically what happens is that the jurors are left alone to be able to deliberate. And the reason behind that is that they are the ones that are entrusted with making this decision, that they should have the privacy and the ability to talk about the issues that the trial presented openly, so that there's no judgment and they can try to come to a verdict. And again, this is not like a civil trial where civil trial, you don't necessarily need a unanimous verdict. The judge had told them you need an unanimous verdict here. Like I said, they're, have a really big decision on their hands. If he's convicted on all charges, he could go to jail for the rest of his life. So they want to be able to have that privacy to deliberate. But of course, there are bailiffs and court officers outside the rooms that can assist with whatever they might need.
The deliberation process, I can't talk about it enough, how important it is. It encapsulates the entire trial, and so much of it is going to be going back to the government's case, because of course, The defense, yes, we heard from them on their openings, their closings, cross-exam. I can't say enough about the cross-exam. They were there and they were coming in hot and heavy for a lot of that cross. However, they didn't put on a traditional case, one that we might normally expect. The defense didn't call any witnesses. It wasn't, again, what we would normally expect. And so I have to remind our viewers, and I know that the judge reminded this to the jurors too, the burden of proof rests on the government. It's not the defense. They are allowed to not call a single witness and say, okay, innocent until proven guilty. The burden is on the government. And I know that's sometimes hard to explain, Elizabeth, but how important is it for the jurors to understand that?
Yeah, it's a great point. It's really important. And one of the things that the judges had instructed the jury when they were off to start making their deliberations was, Combs did not take the stand and he was not required to take the stand. This is a criminal case. It's not a civil case where he'd be mandated to do that. And the fact that he didn't take the stand, it shouldn't be used against him, or the jury shouldn't take that to mean, any evidence of culpability or anything like that. And I thought that was a really important reminder from the judge, because again, that's a right that's protected, under the Constitution. You have the right to protect yourself from self-incrimination, meaning if you don't want to take the stand in a criminal case, you don't have to. So the fact that the judge had made that instruction to the jury, I think he really wanted to ride home the point that it's the prosecution's burden. The fact that he didn't take the stand, it shouldn't be used against him, which I wasn't surprised that he didn't take the stand. I was surprised that the defense didn't put on any witnesses of their own. I think could be a lot of reasons for that. They didn't maybe want to subject their witnesses to cross-examination. They might have saw that there was an uphill battle with some of the witnesses there. Who could they really produce that they could say would be an unbiased witness that could testify as to his good character? So there's all reasons for that, but it's really important to keep that in mind. And that's why I think the judge sent the jury starting off deliberations with that reminder.
There are so many things that the jurors are juggling, right? They have to remember, okay, we can't hold it against P. Diddy, Sean Combs, the defendant, because he didn't take the stand and testify. We can't hold it against the defense because they didn't call any other witness besides Diddy. They've got to think about the burden of proof. They've got to go through and look at all the predicate crimes involving RICO. We're talking bribery. We're talking kidnapping. There's so many things that they have to weigh. Least of all, the fact that we're 2 months into this case and they're trying to remember it all. So for those of you who are just joining us right now, we're breaking in for live coverage, a breaking update that the jurors have asked a question. We're about 7.5 hours into deliberation, and their question is, we would like the transcripts from 2 of the witnesses. Now, the question mark is which witnesses? Not sure, but I do have another update from the court. So AUSA Emily Johnson has now gone back and handed a piece of paper over to Sean Combs' lawyers. So that's the government handing a piece of paper over to the defense. AUSA Maureen Comey goes and sits next to Combs' Xavier Donaldson and shows him something on her laptop. So that's kind of where we're at right now, that both sides are talking about this. Sean Combs is in the courtroom behind me because we are live in the Southern District of Manhattan. So Elizabeth, what are you thinking with both sides conferring like this? It is interesting for me to see the prosecution and the defense kind of talking and chatting together because, of course, they're opposed sides. But what do you think is happening? Can you make sense of all of this with them discussing and handing notes back and forth to each other?
Yeah, it's interesting. So what I'm guessing is that there's a possibility that the jury is asking for further information. If it's just specific pages of trial transcripts that they want to look through, I don't think the counsel would need to be actively involved in that. They could just produce the transcripts. But if it's specific evidence, one of the things that they had asked for was possible evidence of the drug distribution. That goes to the racketeering aspect. So if it's, if you're having jurors that are saying we need this X page of the transcript, you wouldn't really need probably that much conferral from the counsel. But I think because they're asking for maybe a bit more general information about the drug charges, drug distribution, that could be the reason why the attorneys are conferring and figuring out, okay, what information do they exactly need? What can we give them? And which makes sense because whatever information you provide the jurors, both sides need to be appraised of it, need to understand what's going on, so that, there's not any potential argument that they're being given information that could be skewed one way or the other. So I think that could possibly be why there's so much back and forth between the attorneys. Maybe it's a more sort of general question that the jurors are asking. And we've seen that come up. Again, they've asked for information about the drug charges, and that goes more towards the racketeering case.
Yeah, we can talk about the other questions too, because this is not the first juror question we've had so far. This seems like a very active jury, if you were asking me, I would say they're definitely talking through some of the issues, which is a positive thing, right? We're at almost 7.5 hours of deliberation that we have going here, and they do have a lot of questions. So I think you made a good point, Elizabeth, about this open dialogue. And we do have some more questions, by the way, from our viewers. So this is a great question. Spensenable says, why no cameras inside the court? And it's interesting, those of you who have been following along, our girl Anjanette Levy asked me this question yesterday, and I said, I don't know. I mean, all I know is that federal courts don't allow it, but I don't know the answer to that. Why? I should have asked a question. And so thankfully, our producers, Alex and Jordan, have sent me a response. It sounds like the federal rule of Criminal Procedure 53. Now, this rule prohibits photography or broadcasting of judicial proceedings in criminal cases. And I mean, this is true, something that we've seen. Some states don't even allow cameras at all, including New York, where I am right now. So even if it's a state case separate from federal, they don't allow cameras. Now, other states like my home state of Wisconsin, they allow cameras streaming all the time, depending on the trial. So that's kind of where we're at right now. Really good question, though. I'm glad I'm educating myself. I'm learning with you guys throughout all of this, right? Now, another one of our questions from our viewers, Kenny Alexandra, she asked, what would be the worst case scenario if found guilty on any charge? And that would be life in prison. I mean, what do you think, Elizabeth? That's right. The top charge, the worst he could face is life behind bars, right?
That's right. Yeah. And keep in mind also, it's hard to imagine because he just has always sort of had this more youthful kind of partying persona. But Sean Combs is in his 50s. He might be 55. Don't quote me on the exact age. But yeah, exactly. So if he's convicted on these charges with that amount of time and where he's at in his life, he could face the rest of his life in prison. So that would be the worst case scenario. Some might say worst case scenario could also be a potential retrial because having to have prosecutors and defense attorneys and even Sean Combs go through all of this a second time, that's just a nightmare situation for any court case. Prosecutors want to be able to nail this, hopefully on the first try. So it could also be worst case scenario for Sean Combs is facing the rest of his life in prison. Worst case scenario possibly for some of the other people involved is that this has to go to a retrial, which again, it's very preliminary. There's no evidence that that's going to happen. It's just, it's always a slight possibility in cases like this.
It's overwhelming. People having to go years and years waiting and fighting. I clicked on the Atticus ad and filled out.
Prosecution delivered their fiery closing argument in the Sean Diddy Combs criminal trial, highlighting why these are episodes of sex trafficking, why the evidence proves Combs operated a criminal enterprise, and how he directed and arranged multiple instances of transporting people for prostitution. We will break down the highlights of this closing argument right now. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law and Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. Hey everybody, this is another Law and Crime legal alert. If you received Depo-Provera birth control shots and were later diagnosed with a brain or spinal tumor called meningioma, you may be eligible for a lawsuit. That's right, Morgan & Morgan, they're investigating claims that patients weren't properly warned about this risk. It's free to check, just takes a few minutes, and you don't pay unless they win. So scan the QR code on screen, click the link below, or go to forthepeople.com/LCDepo to see if you qualify. Closing arguments are officially underway in the Sean Diddy Combs criminal trial. In fact, the prosecution just wrapped up their closing argument. Remember, this is the last chance for each side to summarize the evidence in this case, present their final conclusion, their narrative for the jury. And it's important. It's important because there's a lot for the jury to consider over these past few weeks. It is a complicated case. There was a lot of evidence. There's a lot of testimony. And closings are the last time the jurors will hear from the attorneys before they begin their deliberations. So we begin with the prosecution's closing argument that was delivered by Assistant United States Attorney Christy Slavic, outlining why the jury should find Combs guilty of 1 count of racketeering conspiracy, 2 counts of sex trafficking by force, fraud, or coercion, 1 with respect to Cassie Ventura Fine, 1 with respect to Jane, and 2 counts of transportation to engage in prostitution. Again, 1 with respect to Cassie, 1 with respect to Jane. I want to bring on right now Law and Crimes reporter Elizabeth Milner, who was inside that courtroom for all of those arguments today. Elizabeth, great to see you. Want to take this piece by piece. Let's start it off with racketeering conspiracy. The top charge, arguably the most complicated charge in the mix, carries life in prison. Okay, so there's a lot at stake here. The prosecutor definitely wanted to make it clear for the jury How did she outline? Let's start this. How did she outline that this is a criminal organization, that there was a criminal agreement? Let's start there before we even move into the underlying predicate crimes that the prosecution needs to prove.
Yeah, so right off the bat, Christy Slavic is really talking about count one, of course, that being racketeering conspiracy, aka RICO. And just right off the bat, she's telling the jury, over the last several weeks, you learned about Sean Combs and then kidnapping an employee, forced labor, arson, bribery, plus brutal crimes are at the heart of the case. She also said, across all of these comes the defendant using his power and violence to get what he wants, and that he doesn't take no for an answer. And so right off the top of her closing argument, the jury has shown exhibit photos, one of March 2016 Intercontinental Hotel still image from that surveillance video where you can kind of see Cassie on the ground after she was initially physically assaulted by Sean Combs on that videotape. And then also the government talked about Sean Combs kicking, choking, and slapping Jane and forcing her into a freak-off, specifically pointing to the instance that happened in June of 2024. And so, the government was like, these instances are separated by 8 years, but they're kind of saying they're one and the same. But I think the most interesting part of just the beginning of the closing argument by the prosecution is that Christy Slavic is like, Sean Combs has a small army of personal staff. No one could stop him. He uses inner circle and money to cover up his crimes, and even referred to his assistants as foot soldiers and other things like that. So really kind of pointing out how the assistants, how those who were in Sean Combs' inner circle really kind of helped build this case of racketeering conspiracy against the defendant.
Yeah, that he's the leader of this criminal organization, that the assistants, the security, they helped pull off the freak-offs. They knew it was wrong. They would go to people. They knew about the sex tapes. They got drugs for freak-offs. Justina Forum, she knew what was going on. D-Rock got ice for Cassie's black eye. So I get it, right? This idea that everybody was on the same page. Now, for the prosecution to win this charge, they have to prove at least two underlying predicate crimes, right? And you tell me what stood out the most. Was it forced labor? Was it kidnapping? Was it arson? Which, by the way, there was a whole back and forth yesterday. Oh, is arson and kidnapping still part of the case? Yes, it is. They might have decided to not move forward with attempted arson or attempted kidnapping, but they're still moving forward with actual kidnapping and arson, conspiracy to commit these crimes. So which of the underlying crimes really stood out to you today? I know the prosecution addressed all of them, but was it forced labor? Was it the drug offenses? Was it arson? Was it kidnapping? Was it bribery? Which were the ones that you think if the jury has to decide, oh, these are the two we're going to find them guilty of, or we think these are the predicate crimes for racketeering, this pattern of criminal activity, which were some of the ones that stood out to you?
Well, to your point, Jesse, the prosecution laying out again that the government only has to prove two of these acts, but as they're listing drug distribution, kidnapping, arson, bribery, sex trafficking, forced labor, witness tampering, interstate transportation for prostitution, you really could pick any of them because I feel like the government made very strong cases for all of them. But some of the ones that really kind of stood out to me, and I think for maybe a different way than maybe people think, was kind of drug distribution, because I think a lot of people, in terms of just the drugs and overall kind of components that go to it, that people think, Sean Combs had to be transporting, kilos and large quantities of drugs. But really, the government was kind of laying out that delivering or passing on drugs kind of counted distribution. And so I think Christy Slavic made a pretty strong argument where she said a special ingredients that talking about the drugs were required for freak-offs. So each and every time she's kind of talking about the predicate act, she's talking about all the players involved. So in terms of drug distribution, she specifically talked about D-Rock, KK, and Fahim Muhammad. And so the two elements that kind of go with that is that the co-conspirators distributed the drugs, but also the second element being that the co-conspirator distributed the drugs knowingly. And so she listed all the drugs out because drugs was something that was very common throughout all the testimony that the witnesses had. So she talked about cocaine, meth, ketamine, oxycodone, Xanax, MDMA, GHB, 2C, and mushrooms as well. And so she said that the quantity is not relevant. It's not an element of this crime. And so she says, the jury has heard a number of names, including Guido, One Stop, Baby Girl, as some of the drug dealers that were used, but also just the money that kind of goes and is attached to just the assistants reaching out to KK or Fahim Muhammad talking about reimbursement for payments such as $450 of a balance for drugs or $780 to go towards the personal Gucci items. And as they talked about throughout a lot of witness testimony, the Gucci items normally refer to the drugs that were in a specific Gucci bag that Sean Combs always had on his person, or that the assistants were required to carry just near and around Sean Combs. But even in terms of just distributing the drugs to others, the prosecution named a number of people that it kind of falls under there, where it's including Cassie and Jane and Carrie Morgan and Vanna and Mia, and how Mia and Brendan Paul specifically were even made to kind of partake in this drug use. Mia testified that she kind of was given a different batch of all these different drugs, and it was kind of like a guessing game of which drug was which drug, and she had to take a line of it. Whereas Brendan Paul talked about the first time he did drugs outside of marijuana was 2C with Sean Combs in order to kind of prove his loyalty. But I think another big thing, Jesse, was just the kidnapping aspect, because to your point, a lot of people are like, oh my God, there's no more kidnapping. Oh my God, there's no more arson. But the prosecution laid out 3 instances of kidnapping. One in January of 2009, when Cassie's face was stomped on and she was held at a hotel because Sean Combs got upset that she was talking to a producer, and Cassie drunkenly punched Sean Combs in the face, and then he physically assaulted her, and that Sean Combs forced her to stay in a hotel for a week, and that Bonds, the security guard, told her that she couldn't leave that hotel. And so the prosecution was like, Cassie didn't consent to staying at the London hotel during this particular alleged incident of kidnapping. And there was another time where they brought it back to 2004 here in New York City with Capricorn Clark and the lie detector test after the jewelry went missing, and how the government said a person restricted victims' movements by confining her to a place. And so the prosecution laid out that the man who administered the test said if she refused, she would be thrown into the East River. That was something that Capricorn Clark had even testified to. And then obviously the biggest instance was December of 2011 with the whole Kid Cudi kind of aspect, where Capricorn Clark says that a gun was pointed at her face by Sean Combs. She was forced into this car and was driven over to Kid Cudi's home, all because Sean Combs was upset that he being Kid Cudi was seeing Cassie Ventura fine. But that Capricorn had even testified again that Sean Combs held a gun at her. She didn't want to go with him, and that all the players involved with that particular instance of alleged kidnapping was Capricorn Clark, Rue, who was a security guard, Sean Combs, how they drove over to Kid Cudi's home, and Capricorn Clark didn't consent. Now, obviously, Jesse, there's a number of other interesting points where you talk about bribery and other things too that are very interesting, but those to me are the ones that definitely stood out the most.
Yeah, bribery. Eddie Garcia, the hotel security guard who was allegedly paid $100,000 that he split with others to hand over the videotape of Sean Combs reportedly beating Cassie. I thought that was a significant point. Forced labor, the idea of Mia, his personal assistant, being allegedly sexually assaulted by Sean Combs, but also the idea of the 2 main alleged victims in this case, Jane and Cassie. They were forced to perform sex acts, right? This forced labor concept. So let's talk about Jane and let's talk about Cassie. Let's take it piece by piece. They each make up, as I said, individual sex trafficking counts and individual counts of transportation to engage in prostitution. But when we talk about sex trafficking by force, fraud, or coercion, let's talk about Jane. What did the prosecutor say today in closing arguments to say that Jane is a victim of sex trafficking by force, fraud, or coercion? What did she say about that?
Well, I think, Jesse, the sex trafficking aspect, as it specifically pertains to Jane, is pretty interesting because the government says you only have to find one instance of sex trafficking. So sure, the government has a very long list of all these different flights and locations and hotel rooms, all to kind of point out that all of these instances of hotel nights were possibly alleged sex trafficking, but only the jury has to find one particular instance, and then the defendant, in the perfect way the government probably wants, is guilty of sex trafficking. But as it comes to Jane, and by the way, whenever they were talking about Jane, the gallery screen that we're able to see that kind of shows the public and the media and everyone who's sitting inside the courtroom, that was completely shut off. So only the jury is seeing these particular exhibits, the text messages, the photos, as it pertains to Jane, mainly because, of Jane, she testified under a pseudonym and they just want to protect her privacy just a little bit more. But in terms of just the different stages of sex trafficking, the government said that the first stage was Jane kind of learning about the drugs and the outfits and putting pornography on, because they were saying that Sean Combs kind of groomed Jane into sex trafficking. So they say that first stage, again, being the drugs, the outfit, putting pornography on, something that kind of Diddy enjoyed according to her testimony. But she said the second stage was the fantasy talk, and how the fantasy talk kind of pertained to Jane with other men, and that Sean Combs made it happen eventually. And then that third stage was using a payment of rent, because as we know, Sean Combs was paying for her rent $10,000 a month, which we learned during the trial that he's still paying for even at this time, but that payment of rent was used as leverage. And so Christy Slavic is like, he reminds her he can take things away from her anytime that he wants to. And so the government said that the hotel nights weren't about what Jane wanted, it was about what the defendant wanted. He made Jane sex with the entertainers because, as the defense kind of pointed out, using Jane's messages kind of in a way against her, we're saying, okay, hey, look, she's reaching out to these escorts or these entertainers all on her own. But the government is saying that Sean Combs made Jane kind of sex with these entertainers, and that Jane wanted the escorts to wear condoms. However, Sean Combs didn't want them to wear condoms, and that he would be dismissive and condescending whenever she kind of was vocal about wanting these escorts to wear protection. The government also saying throughout those months, the defendant continued to dangle different carrots in her face, such as gifts, such as trips, such as shopping. And then we heard an audio message from Sean Combs to Jane where he says, you know, I'm not going to play these games with you. You'll just have silence. We can have spats, but you need to get on your job. And the government's kind of pointing out that get on your job was her doing these hotel nights. But in terms of Jane kind of voicing her opinion about not wanting to do the hotel nights, because if you go back to her testimony at the beginning, she thought initially that it was going to be a one-time thing, that at first it was exciting and taboo, and she just wanted to pretty much please her partner. But then towards the end, she was kind of voicing that she felt like these hotel nights were all that she was used for, and that she said she was saying these things about voicing her opinions, that she was saying it for months even prior to Cassie's lawsuit, where the jury was able to see some messages from Jane to Sean Combs where she says, I feel like I'm reading my own sexual trauma. On 2 of my birthdays, you forced me to perform with with entertainers. Then the jury was able to hear, you know, these audio recordings, some that we've already heard before, where Jane is saying, you know, I want you to know, and then Sean Combs kind of cuts her off, and he says, are you recording me? What are you talking about? Kind of showing these different instances where it turns out she was being recorded, but that Sean Combs in a way was kind of playing it like, oh, maybe he's manipulating her because he's implying that she's recording him when truly she was the one that was being recorded on. And so then they kind of talked about after Cassie's lawsuit, where Jane's relationship with Sean Combs changed. She stopped seeing him for months, but the government points out that Sean Combs told Jane to charge him, and charge him. They kind of imply that it was to buy her silence, because Jane had asked for about $100,000 per year that they were together for her loss of money and her time, plus what she had to endure for these hotel nights, and kind of pointing out that charging was significantly less than what Cassie ended up getting in her settlement with Sean Combs after she filed her lawsuit. But in terms of just threats that were made too, the government pointed out that Sean Combs threatened to release her sex tapes to her child's father, and that the government says that Jane reached out to Christina Quorum about the threats, and that she again didn't speak with him for about 2 months after he had threatened to release these sexually explicit videos and photos of her to her child's father, and that they ended up reconnecting and around her birthday, which is in February of 2024, because Sean Combs says that they would spend wholesome time together. Lo and behold, that an escort was being contacted by Sean Combs so that way they could do another hotel night. So those were just some of the instances of sex trafficking by Jane. But in terms of just all these different instances of specific sex trafficking, they point to the sobriety party of October of 2023, where Jane wanted to do a hotel night without drugs, and then she ended up throwing up in between escort number 2 and escort number 3. They also point to the June 18th, 2024 incident that happened at Jane's house, where she was physically assaulted, and then at the end of it, when she said she was forced to do a hotel night even after being assaulted, Sean Combs said something to her saying, is this coercion? And I think the government was really kind of pointing out that coercion was the specific word that Sean Combs used. And so those were just some of the instances of alleged sex trafficking as it pertains to Jane.
Yeah. And that goes to knowledge. That goes to the knowledge component. The defense is going to say, how was he supposed to know they didn't really want this? Well, if the jury believes that he said that to her, that's significant. And I have to tell you, I think the highlight from this day was the prosecution saying that consenting once or consenting several times doesn't mean that either a Jane or a Cassie consented every time. One instance of sex trafficking, you laid them out so perfectly, the jury has to believe just one of them. If it fits the elements of sex trafficking, he could be convicted of that. Now, we go on to Cassie, okay? Cassie Ventura Fine. Why, according to prosecutor Slavic, is she a victim of sex trafficking?
Yeah, well, right off the top, when it came to count 2, and that again pertaining to Cassie, the prosecution said, before there was Jane, because they talked about all the points related to Jane, they talked about Cassie afterwards. So she had said before there was Jane, there was Cassie. And so they were really kind of laying out the roadmap as how this sex trafficking pretty much came to be, where it started with early points of their relationship, then it went into the abuse, then it went into the freak-offs, then it went into the end of their relationship. So at the beginning stages of their relationship, Cassie is around 19 years old. She signs a bad boy. And so the government's kind of pointing out not only is she dating a significantly older man, but also that this man also happens to be her boss. And so the government was also talking about just the abuse she endured. And I think that's something that they may have on their side, where they have photos, they have video evidence, i.e. the surveillance video from the Intercontinental Hotel, that kind of possibly may work in the government's favor, especially as it pertains to Cassie. And so the government said the defense doesn't deny the abuse, that the defendant just wants to pretty much call it domestic violence. And that's something that a lot of people, even on social media, are saying. They're like, this isn't sex trafficking. This is a domestic violence case. He should have been charged with domestic violence. But according to the government and the way they were laying it out, they're kind of saying, there's a lot of different examples when it comes to sex trafficking in Cassie. And they really kind of talked about the amount of violence examples, really pointing out that the ones they listed in their closing argument were just one of many. So they point to the 2007 incident that happened after a dinner, 2010 after a Princess party, or at Prince's party, where Prince's security even had to intervene. They talked about 2011, where Sean Combs attacked Cassie after he found out she was sleeping with Kid Cudi. 2013, when Sean Combs attacked Cassie in her apartment when Cassie was with Mia and Deontay. 2013, again that same year, where Sean Combs assaulted Cassie in Jamaica because she was taking too long in the bathroom. 2015, where Sean Combs beat up Cassie at a Las Vegas party, and D-Rock actually ended up crying after seeing Cassie's injuries. And then, of course, the 2016 incident that happened at the Intercontinental Hotel. But the government also pointing out that Sean Combs attacked Cassie's friends too, like Deontay Nash and Vanna and Mia and even Carrie Morgan, all of which had testified to when they were called to testify in this specific trial. But in terms of just kind of using even Dr. John Hughes' testimony to kind of help paint the picture a little bit more in these summations, the question always is, why didn't she leave? And so the government points to Dr. Hughes' testimony about Sean Combs' inner circle kind of helping preventing Cassie from leaving at times. They point to Christina Coram and Ruben and Roger.
Oh. Hey, did you find the manual? Yes, of course I found it.
Omega Institute is nestled in the heart of New York's Hudson Valley.
Hello, welcome to Omega.
Our 250-acre campus has a vibrant village atmosphere with lots to discover. Visit the Omega Wellness Center to indulge in a massage or healing arts session. Don't miss our beautiful gardens, serene lake, and hiking trails. Our community is built on shared experiences and meaningful connections. Thank you for choosing Omega and enjoy your stay.
Bonds and even D-Rock, where Christina Coram did all the defendant's bidding. D-Rock was only loyal to the defendant. D-Rock, at one point, text messages were shown of D-Rock telling Sean Combs, Cass is calling the studio. She's looking for you. Sean Combs says, time for the ice. What's Cass up to? Does her eye look better? How is she holding up? And then D-Rock responds, well, Rio and Justin saw her. We said that a fight broke out in the club. And again, these are messages that the jury's already seen, but really kind of putting into context as it pertains to count 2. And then, of course, the freak-offs. And so the government really was talking about how over the course of their relationship, there were hundreds of freak-offs. I mean, the two were together for 11 years on and off, but the government showed text messages where Cassie said, I love our FOs when we both want them. And so I think kind of pointing to, Cassie initially consented to doing this, but towards the end to her testimony and even pointing back to her lawsuit, just because she agreed to do it once doesn't mean she agreed to do it every single time, every single instance. And she even said that she had to do these freak-offs while she was on her menstrual cycle, and she had a UTI, and how escorts urinated in her mouth. And the government says that you being the jury, don't have to prove prove every freak off with sex trafficking, just one. And so they said it's not an all or nothing thing. It's really just that one instant that could possibly make him guilty of sex trafficking.
And I will tell you, I thought it was brilliant for the prosecution to sprinkle in the testimony of Dr. Dawn Hughes to explain what sometimes would look like inconsistent behavior of a victim, to explain why this happens. And so to keep bringing her up at certain critical times as they talk about Cassie, very, very important. Now I want to move on to the final charges. So we got transportation to engage in prostitution, which I have said feels like the most straightforward charge. Prosecutors have to prove that he literally transported not even sex workers. They don't even have to be prostitutes, just men across state lines for the purposes of sex work. That's it, right? Transporting them and the alleged victims for the purposes of sex work. I think they even highlighted today, you don't need force, fraud, or coercion. You don't even need really consent. So what did you say about transportation to engage in prostitution?
Well, I think a lot of people have to remember that that goes to count 3 and count 5. Count 3, again, going to Cassie, and then count 5 going to James. So he's charged 2 different ways with this. And then it also kind of falls under count 1 with RICO conspiracy too. But in terms of count 3 related to Cassie, the government says that the defendant told Cassie to book travel for these escorts, and that these escorts would travel to places like Ibiza, as an example, or New York City. And so they kind of brought back that flight summary chart again, something that I think kind of works in their favor, because the jury can take this back when they go to deliberations and really see everything kind of laid out in a way like a roadmap. And so they point to one specific instance starting in August of 2009, August 26th of that year, where Sean Combs coordinated with Jules being the escort that Cassie and Sean Combs used often during their break-offs, but